The importance of jazz in music education has finally begun to be acknowledged, and increasing numbers of teachers are making efforts to learn the idiom and to find a method and materials for teaching the subject. In order to teach jazz effectively, ideally one should believe in the validity of jazz as an art form worthy of study. But even if one does not, one can certainly recognize the motivational value of jazz materials when they're included as part of the overall music program. I needn't tell you about the incredible dropout rate that characterizes keyboard education, and I've been going around the country making a case for the use of jazz and other creative techniques as a means of motivating students in order to keep them from abandoning their studies in music. And of course, in order to teach jazz effectively, it's imperative that teachers familiarize themselves with the subject and with the elements that go into its creation and into its performance tradition. Contrary to the belief held by many that jazz cannot be taught, I feel that jazz can be broken down into identifiable elements and taught in a methodical, sequential manner with the same authenticity, skill, and discipline ordinarily associated with the teaching of classical music. And I'm here today to share this point of view with you and to show you how my materials follow this procedure. Believing as I do in the value of traditional classical training, I frequently incorporate classical concepts in my books, but as you might expect, they appear in a jazz framework. In writing the books, I attempted at all times to teach total musicianship, not only as a feeling for the jazz idiom imparted, but technical keyboard skills are developed and sophisticated musicological information is taught, as you will see. Before I get into the books themselves, I'd like to make a couple of important points. One point is I'd like to assure you that I haven't come all this way from New York City to get you to abandon the teaching of classical music and to take up jazz instead, but rather I'm here to talk about the inner workings and merits of jazz and other creative techniques, and I hope that you'll consider incorporating some of these concepts in your teaching for perhaps as little as 5 or 10 minutes at every lesson as both a musicological and motivational tool. Another point that I want to make is that you yourselves do not have to be proficient jazz pianists to teach jazz principles. I always tell audiences about my first piano teacher, with whom I studied for 10 years from the age of 5. She had had a childhood affliction that resulted in one of her arms being much shorter than the other. As a consequence, she could barely demonstrate for her students. She nevertheless produced a crop of outstanding pianists who were, even better than that, terrific musicians, because she knew what to teach, she knew the order in which to teach that material. And this was in an era that predated the appearance on the market of all of these methods that tell teachers what to do every step of the way. Well, having said that you don't have to be proficient jazz pianists to teach jazz principles, I'd also like to make a couple of promises to you. One promise is that by the end of this workshop today, you are going to be totally comfortable with the thought that you can take jazz materials home with you and make them sound authentic. And another promise that I'm going to make is that by the end of this workshop, you are going to know more about jazz than a lot of jazz musicians. It may sound presumptuous for me to make a statement like that, but I'm sure you'll agree that many jazz musicians do by instinct rather than by theoretical knowledge. In fact, if you were to ask a jazz musician to explain to you what it is that he or she is doing, an answer you might hear would be something like, I don't know, man. They say man whether they're talking to a man or a woman. On your chairs, you have a list of all of my currently in print materials, although 1 or 2 titles may no longer be in print. I'm not certain what the publisher has done. And in addition, there is a free packet. If you would open the free packet, you'll notice that there is this book called Jazz and Musical Creativity in that packet. And this contains a number of articles that I've written for various music magazines, such as Piano Quarterly. And in the back of this book are additional materials that I'd like for us to look at together at various points during the workshop, particularly in the second half of my workshop after our mid-morning break. The other 2 books in this free packet are teacher's manuals. Take 10 for jazz, which means take 10 minutes of your time to teach jazz, and take 10 more for jazz. These manuals were created for my publisher, Hal Leonard, and for me by Dr. Martha Baker, who is the head of piano pedagogy at California State University in Fullerton, California. She's also known today as Martha Baker Jordan, and about 3 years ago she wrote a big, thick book for Warner Brothers called Practical Piano Pedagogy, a book to which I contributed a chapter on my recommended methods for incorporating jazz into the classical lesson. Now, Take 10 for Jazz contains 33 10-minute lesson plans for the 4 intermediate level books listed on the front cover. When I say 10-minute lesson plans, I'm actually referring to the fact that on every page there are 2 5-minute lesson plans. One is dealing with improvisational concepts, and one is for a book dealing with jazz elements other than improvisational concepts. The follow-up manual, Take 10 More for Jazz, provides well over 100 lesson plans for the 4 intermediate to upper intermediate level books listed on its cover. If you've never had prior exposure to jazz or prior teaching experience with jazz, these 2 manuals will give you detailed instructions for lesson plans for teaching your intermediate to upper intermediate level students with these 8 books for which lesson plans are provided. Before we see how these lesson plans work, why don't we look at the first book for which lesson plans provided. That's called the Easy Piano Jazz Rhythm Primer. And you'll find that book in the top packet on these stacks. There are 4 packets, packets 1, 2, 3, and 4. Packet 1 contains this book. If you take everything out of packet 1, and please share when you're sitting next to a packet. We'll look at this book called Easy Piano Jazz Rhythm Primer. Packet 1. Do you have that? Packet 1. Check it out and find this book, please.
Yeah, well, I was thinking you should post.
You should sit next to where they are.
Because they're on sale for
Or here's a packet 1 here.
I was just looking at
Does anybody else have a packet 1?
seen a demotivators despair.com.
You can sit next to
Despair.com. Okay. So I love the ambition one.
I'd like to say ladies and gentlemen, but I don't see any gentlemen, so I'll just say ladies.
Back there.
Right.
And she's like, do you get it
In 1930,
clothes?
In 1930, a man named Winthrop Sargent, who became the jazz critic for the New Yorker magazine, a job that he held for a couple of decades, created a very important pioneering analytical study in the field of jazz called Jazz, Hot and Hybrid, published by the Capo Press. And what he did to create that analytical study of jazz was to listen to recordings made by the most prominent jazz musicians of the 1920s. These would include Louis Armstrong, the first great improviser in the history of jazz, and he played the trumpet, and Sidney Bechet, a contemporary of his, who played the soprano saxophone and clarinet, Bessie Smith, the blues singer, and others of their ilk. And Mr. Sargent came to the conclusion that all of these jazz players were doing pretty much the same things as one another, especially with respect to the notes that were being employed in their improvisations and to the rhythms that were being employed. So when I read his book, Jazz, Hot and Hybrid, I decided that I could create books of my own based upon his findings. And this is one of the books that I created, the Easy Piano Jazz Rhythm Primer. Now, one of his findings was, with respect to rhythm, that all jazz rhythms can be placed into 2 broad categories: simple syncopation and polyrhythmic syncopation. Let's just consider what syncopation really is. Syncopation means that an accent is being removed from where one would ordinarily expect to find it, the so-called strong beat, or the strong part of the beat, beats 1 and 3 in a 4/4 measure, and placed instead on the weak beats, or the weak parts of the beats, beats 2 and 4. This book provides opportunities for the student to play various types of simple syncopation and polyrhythmic syncopation. On page 2 of this book, you'll notice that I have an ordinary C major scale with accents on strong beats in a non-jazz manner. At the bottom of the page, I shift the accent to the weak beat in more of a jazz manner. That's the hardest thing for the classical musician to do, is to put accents on weak beats. I can always tell when I attend a jazz performance who in the audience has had prior jazz exposure and who has not. Those with prior jazz exposure snap their fingers on 2 and 4, and everybody else on 1 and 3. Another way to achieve accent displacement appears on page 6 where I have two songs that are actually the same song, but one is the unsyncopated version and the other is not. This page teaches anticipation of the beat. At the bottom of the page of the unsyncopated version, I do not have anticipation. Notice I have a note on beat 1 of measure 2, the strong beat. But up above in the syncopated version, I play that a beat earlier, putting it on beat 4 of measure 1, the weak beat. Tying it over into the next bar, explaining to the student on page 9 what it is that I did and how I accomplished it. Now, if you can achieve accent displacement through anticipation of the beat, then you should also be able to achieve it through delay of the beat. And that's what I show on page 8. In the first section of the piece, all the notes fall on strong beat. But in the second section of the piece, many notes fall on weak beats and others on weak parts of beats. And on page 9, I show that it's possible to achieve the effect of an accent without actually accenting by harmonizing a melody with chords that fall only on the weak beats. These are examples of simple syncopation. Starting on the next page are examples of polyrhythmic syncopation, which means that two or more rhythms are occurring simultaneously. In the swing era, which is also known as the big band era, there was a famous band led by Glenn Miller, and their biggest hit, which is known by everybody even today, was a song that featured polyrhythmic syncopation. The bass player, my left hand, was playing groups of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Others in the band were playing groups of 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This is called In the Mood. You all know that song, I'm sure. At the time that I was writing this book, I did not have access to that copyright. And so I had to create my own In the Mood, which I did on page 11. In this piece, the left hand plays groups of 4, the right plays groups of 3. Polyrhythmic syncopation. The left plays 1, 2, 1, 2. The right goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. The piece is called ragu, which, as you know, is a stew. Teacher's Manual, Take 10 for Jazz, works with this book. If you open Take 10 for Jazz to pages 2 and 3, you'll notice that there's an introduction that ideally should be read before working with this Teacher's Manual. May I direct your attention to the top of page 3. Number 7 says, in lesson plans where the word discuss is used, this means that the teacher should read or paraphrase the composer's explanations to the student at the lesson. Number 9 says lesson plans can be divided if you want your students to go at a slower pace. By that I mean, as I told you, that on every page there are 2 lesson plans for 5 minutes each. If you want to spend only 5 minutes at the lesson on jazz rather than 10 minutes, go through the lesson plans for one book, come back into the lesson plans for the other book. The abbreviations in the middle of the page are rather obvious. T stands for teacher, S for student. ATD means at a teacher's discretion, and so on. Then at the bottom of the page, there's an optional suggestion. You know, I have pages and pages of different rhythms at various levels, and I, at every lesson, ask my students to tap the rhythms. But I don't ask them to tap a table with a pencil. To make it a little more jazzy, I give them a drum brush, which drummers use to play softly, and we tap a book with the drum brush. So that's what that drum brush paragraph is all about. There are 2 lesson plans on page 5. One is for the Easy Piano Jazz Rhythm Primer, which we just looked at, and the other is for a book called Beginning Jazz Improvisation. I'm going to save all of my comments about improvisation for the unit that will follow our mid-morning break. But let's look at this lesson plan for the Easy Piano Jazz Rhythm Primer. It says, page 2, discuss. So I open the Easy Piano Jazz Rhythm Primer to page 2, and sure enough, there's text there. I read it to the student, or the student reads it to me. And then it says, teacher demonstrates a minimum of 2 times. So I play the scale first with the accents on the strong beats, and then with the accents on the weak beats. Then it says, student does slowly blank times, ATD, at teacher's discretion, however many times you want your student to play. Additional activities include teacher and student clapping both examples, teacher playing while the student claps, and the teacher playing the scale with the accents on the weak beats as the student plays the weak beat accents with the drum brush. And as you can see, this is a 5-minute lesson plan. We deliberately held it down to 5 minutes because we know many of you give half-hour lessons and you don't want any one subject to dominate. I must be candid with you. I've never in my life given a half-hour lesson. But then I don't accept the real young students with the short attention span. The youngest I will take will be a high school age student, and I have a very erratic schedule, very demanding schedule. So at the end of the lesson, I take out my book and I say, let's see when we can see each other again. I can't give somebody a steady Wednesday at 4 o'clock kind of thing. So it's a very ad hoc approach. And I only take 3 or 4 students at any one time because I have, I've written 93 books and I can't write a lot of books unless I spend time writing books. So, and my college teaching schedule is also tricky. I was once offered a 4.5-year-old student who I hated to turn down because his last name was Gershwin. I recommended somebody else. Actually, I recommended Paul Sheptel. Maybe you probably know. Well, now before I wrote this book, The Easy Piano Jazz Rhythm Primer, I wrote another book that teaches the same pedagogical principles, but instead of staying at the same level throughout, goes from beginning to advanced, all in one book. You don't have the book there, but that book is on that rack at the side of the room, where I have all supplementary materials that are not in the packets that you have at your seats. And this book is called The Rhythms of Keyboard Jazz. And as I said, it goes from beginning to advanced, all in one book. Now, if you want to play more sophisticated pieces that demonstrate the pedagogical principles that are described in these books, this book will have the more sophisticated material. In order to develop insights into the jazz idiom, let's look at another book that has teacher manuals plans. Actually, Take 10 for Jazz has a lesson plans for this book called The Elements of Jazz. On page 5, I begin to present several examples of the jazz syncopation technique called anticipation of the beat. You'll notice that the melody in the first piece, called Up and Down, consists of the first 5 notes of the C major scale. In fact, a good deal of the melodic content of this book is scale materials. In measure 3, I have an anticipation of the third beat. If I hadn't had an anticipation there, I would have had 4 quarter notes in that measure. And to make it easy for the student to feel and count that anticipation, I've anchored it with half notes on the strong beats in the other hand. Also note that measures 5 through 8 represent the reversed hands version of measures 1 through 4. I do this quite a bit in my music to create an equal challenge to both hands. Publishers have done a great disservice to the teaching community and to students by publishing materials that, for the most part, make demands on the right hand to a greater extent than the left hand. So I wanted to avoid that pitfall. My own first excellent piano teacher, with whom I studied for 10 years, gave me materials that developed my right hand more than my left. That by the end of the second year of piano playing, my right hand was a better pianist than my left hand. The second piece on this page, Up and Down Together, is the same melody, but here I remove the anchor, so now the student has to be able to feel and count that anticipation without the assistance of an on-the-beat tone. The third piece on this page, Opposites Attract, utilizes the same melody one more time, but transposed to the key of F major. The meter changed from 4/4 to 2/4, and contrary motion introduced. There are 3 more examples of anticipation of the beat on page 6. Let's look at the one in the middle of the page called Rub Your Belly, Pat Your Head. Remember that coordination problem when you switch hands? To achieve an analogous effect in music, what I do here is to switch the anticipation from hand to hand. On page 7, I've outlined the chord structure of a very important musical form in jazz called blues. It's a wonderful form to work with because it's a short form, 12 measures, and it uses only 3 chords, the tonic, subdominant, and dominant 7 chords. And the piece below adheres to that chord structure. But frankly, I'm more interested in teaching something else on this page than I am in teaching blues chord structure. The text in the middle of the page alludes to that. You classical teachers work very hard to get your students to play with a good legato touch, although not all classical music is legato. Well, not all jazz is played with a detached touch, but a good deal of the jazz effect is frequently achieved by playing certain tones detached, especially the ones at the ends of phrases. If one attempts to play jazz without playing with the appropriate articulations, one may not get jazz. I have marked my music very carefully so that if the articulations, the staccatos, tenutos, phrasing, and so on, are observed, the student will sound authentically jazzy. So if you work with my materials, please don't settle for the notes alone. Insist upon the articulations. I have a friend in New York City by the name of Bert Conowitz who wrote a book many years ago that has a very revealing title. The title is Jazz is a Way of Playing. Page 11 features a piece that shows accent displacement, putting accents on the weak beats, the so-called off beats. It's a grace note, but it's a grace note attached to a 2-note chord. However, instead of having my grace note embellish the top note of the chord, as you might find in classical music, it instead embellishes the bottom note of the chord. For example, my first grace note is an A sharp, which embellishes the B, as opposed to classical music where you might have a C sharp, which would embellish the D. It's a subtle distinction, but you'll hear it. I have 2 grace notes leading up to the first note of that D major scale. At the turn of the previous century, when ragtime composers were creating their music, they used to use a device of 2 grace notes quite a bit. So what I did was I took that scale at the top of the page, and at the bottom of the page, I created a ragtime arrangement of it. If nothing else, your students will learn how to play the D major scale. On page 21, one hand plays legato, the other plays staccato. Starting in measure 5, the hands are reversed, so both hands have an opportunity to carry the melody and the accompaniment. And on page 22, we talk about ostinato. Ostinato, as you know, is a constantly repeated figure, and when you repeat something in music, it tends to unify the music, just as if you repeat a color in your clothing combination. I have black shoes, black pants, black belt, black. I think I'm a little too unified this morning. But, you know, composers have always wrestled with the problem of balancing the forces of unity and variety in their music. And that's why they have enjoyed working with certain musical forms, because those forms force them into a judicious mixture of elements of unity and variety. Just consider sonata form, for example. Sonata form, in the larger perspective, is an A-B-A form. The second A repeats the first A, creating unity. The B, or development section, is the contrasting material, which creates variety. Rock and roll has a lot of repetition to create unity, but some people are hard-pressed to find the melody. So they find it an onerous musical experience. Latin music, by contrast, has interesting melodies. So once the melody begins, you hear the ostinato only peripherally. I have two ostinatos. One is a 16th note scale passage that continually reappears, and the other is an 8th note pattern that runs throughout. Did you notice that I play those 8th notes very evenly? 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and... Sometimes when jazz musicians see 8th notes, they don't play them evenly, they play them unevenly. What they're actually doing is playing a triplet. And they're having the first 8th note held for two parts of the triplet, the second 8th note held for the third part of the triplet. And the jazz musicians also do this with dotted 8/16. Now, what I ask my students to do when they see this rhythm or that rhythm, and I want them to play jazz, is to first count it, traditional classical counting, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, 1 E-ender, 2 E-ender, and so on. Then I say to them, now jazz it up. And then they play 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 1 and a 2 and a... But I say, since you're not playing on the end, don't say the end. So just go 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, And then after they've played it both ways, I say, which do you like better? And they invariably say the swing 8th way. It's called swing 8ths, or sometimes called jazz triplet. If I were to play this as straight 8ths, you might make a case for it sounding more like rock and roll, because rock musicians never play swing 8. Jazz it up, and they go 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4, and except they don't say the end, they go 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, By the way, there are a couple of words in the title with which you may be unfamiliar. The word riff is the jazz musician's slang way of referring to ostinato. The word dig, well, if you have teenage children, you'll know that dig can mean either of two things. It can mean to like or appreciate something. Did you dig the film you saw last night? It can also mean to understand. Do you dig what I'm saying? I could have called the piece, instead of dig the riff, I could have said, appreciate the ostinato. There are a couple of duets in the book. But following that, on page 29, I make a very important distinction between tertian, otherwise known as triadic harmony, and quartal harmony. In triadic harmony, chords are built in intervals of thirds. In quartal harmony, chords are built in intervals of perfect fourths. When you have triads, you have notes that have been drawn from scales that have certain properties. I'm referring to diatonic scales, major and minor scales being diatonic. When you have, and one of the definitions of a diatonic scale is it must have 5 whole steps and 2 half steps. When you have a combination of half steps and whole steps, you have a condition resulting called tonality, the feeling that the music revolves around one central fundamental tone called the tonic. I deliberately delayed playing that tonic tone so that you get the sense that there's this magnetic pull to the tonic. How did I achieve it? Whole step, half step. As soon as I equalize the intervals, I lose the sense of key. Exclusively half steps, the first 8-tonal scale in all of music history, the chromatic scale. Debussy invented the whole tone scale, exclusively whole steps, for the specific purpose of creating tonal ambiguity in his music. Just consider the diminished seventh chord. It consists of 3 minor thirds. This chord is the most ambiguous chord in all of music in terms of tonality by virtue of its equal interval relationships, 3 minor thirds. And as a consequence, it has the greatest resolution potential of any chord in all of music. Consider a group of perfect fourths, a quartal series. What key is that in? How about a quintal series, all perfect fifths? What key is that in? Well, composers in the 20th century decided from that triad and to use quartal materials especially. And when they did, of course, you couldn't tell what key their music was in. But something else very interesting happened when they did that. If you notice at the bottom of page 29, I have a chord under which it's written root position quartal chord. You'll notice that I do not call it a triad because it is not a triad. I know a triad has 3 notes and that has 3 notes, but it is not a triad because in order for a chord to be a triad, it has to do more than just have 3 notes. You see, it has to be ultimately reducible to a consecutive order arrangement of tones on the staff. Line, 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 or space, 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 which means thirds. There's no amount of octave displacement that I can employ with this chord that would ever result in a consecutive order arrangement of tones on the staff. So it is a chord, does have 3 notes, but it is not a triad. And let's examine the intervals relationships in this chord. I have a perfect fourth, and a 7th. If I raise the bottom note an octave, I get the first inversion of the chord. And the intervals present here are a fourth, a fifth, and a second. The second inversion similarly contains a fourth, a fifth, and a second. So when you hear quartal music, you may expect 2 things to occur. One is you're not going to know what key your music's in, and the other is you're going to hear many intervals of seconds, sevenths, fourths, and fifths. If you ever hear music that sounds a little like this, don't say the composer didn't know what he was doing. Go quartal harmony, you'll probably be right. Here's an interesting piece to analyze. It's by Villalobos. It's called Polichinelle. The right hand is playing pure triads, but the 2 hands together are playing quartal intervals. Here's a composer sitting on the fence between 20th century writing and writing of an earlier period. I have 2 pieces in this book that utilize quartal materials. On pages 30 and 31, I have a duet of a piece that some people call East Side, West Side. But I'm going to play for you the solo piece on page 32. It's a piece called Full Chord. It's a composition written in quartal style. You'll notice that there's a key signature of 2 sharps, which would suggest either I'm in D major or B minor, but I think that you're not going to be able to tell which of those two keys I'm actually in until we get to the last chord. See, the last chord is the giveaway. It's a tertian chord, a triadic chord, by virtue of the fact that there's a D and an F sharp there, and it tells you unequivocally that this piece is in D major. Sophisticated concept like this to my students, and I can give you a couple of good reasons. One reason is, apart from the fact that I'm teaching musicianship with this information, one reason is that my student will be able to tell why the music of Mozart that he played for me at the last lesson will sound a lot different than the music of Bartok that I'm giving him at this lesson. And another thing is that if he goes to a concert and hears music of different historical periods, he'll be able to tell why that music sounds different from the perspective of the use of harmony. Another thing is, if he wants to sound like today's jazz pianists, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock, McCoy Tyner, among them, he has to do what those players are doing. In the old days, you would emulate a stylistic trait. When I was a kid, I used to listen to the Benny Goodman Band, and Teddy Wilson used to play a lot of tenths. I had a big hand right from an early age, so I could play tenths that sound a little like Teddy Wilson. But if I want to sound like Chick Corea or Herbie Hancock or McCoy Tyner, I have to know chordal harmony, I have to know the pentatonic scale and all its manipulations, and I have to know the medieval diatonic church modes, Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. By the way, those modes are used by the jazz musicians in ways in which they were never used in liturgical or folk music. I'm going to be talking extensively about modes towards the end of my presentation today. It's the most interesting subject. Incidentally, I've had the good fortune of having been published rather widely in Japan. And this book was published in Japan a number of years ago with this cover. They do a beautiful job with the graphics in Japan. Have you ever seen Japanese music? Same as American music, but you can't read the text. A Japanese lady once told me that this up here says Ree Evans. I've also had the good fortune of having been published in Russia, and this is the first book I ever wrote in America with a Russian cover. I'll show you this book when we get to packet 4 later today. It says, it's called Jazz Flavored Scale Patterns and Exercises. And this says L. Evans, I'm told. This says jazz. And in the back it says 80K, where my finger is, see 80K. That means if you have 80 kopecks, you can buy this book. Let's develop additional insights into the jazz idiom by looking at this book called Further Experiences with the Elements of Jazz, which has lesson plans provided for it by the follow-up teacher's manual, Take 10 More for Jazz. And if you open the book to page 6 and 7, you'll see that there's a blues scale at the top of the page. Now the blues scale is not a scale that one ordinarily practices for the development of technique as one might practice the major, melodic minor, and harmonic minor scales. The importance of the blues scale lies in the fact that there are 3 notes there called blue notes that are actually lowered 3rd, 5th, and 7th notes of the major scale. And those blue notes are what give jazz its distinctive sound. Flat 7, flat 3, flat 7, flat 3. Can you imagine if I played that Gershwin passage diatonically instead? It takes the jazz right out of it. Recognizing the importance of those blue notes to the sound of jazz, I decided when I created my first improvisation book, which we'll see later, called Beginning Jazz Improvisation, I added 1 blue note at a time with chord tones, so in blues structure. So when the left hand is playing the 1 chord in C major, it's the C major triad, for melody notes, the right hand may use those same pitches, C, E, and G, plus E flat, the flatted 3rd, the blue note of C. When the left hand plays the 4 chord, the F triad, the right hand for melody notes may use those same pitches, F, A, C, plus A flat, the flatted 3rd of F, and the same for the 5 chord. And after the student has improvised in several different keys, combining 1 blue note with chord tones, I then ask the student to combine 2 blue notes with chord tones and then 3 blue notes. So it's a very sequential, organized, easy to implement process, as you will see later in my program today. This piece on pages 6 and 7 is designed to illustrate to the student the relationship between the major scale and the blues scale. I call a note a flatted fifth, I spell it that way. In the key of C major, for example, a flatted fifth is spelled as a G flat. It's not spelled as an F sharp. I'm very careful to be consistent with my diatonic spelling. And I would like to show you the reason why. I'm going to put a grand staff on the blackboard. And I'm going to write on the blackboard an ordinary C dominant seventh chord. If I want to get a jazzier sound, what I'll do is add one of those blue notes on top, the E flat. It gives it a lovely jazz ring. Of course, this is the E natural. Here's your C7 chord, and here's the E flat. Now, I would account for this E flat in the chord symbol by referring to it as a flatted tenth. This is your third, so that's the tenth. C7 flat tenth. Jazz musicians, however, might be inclined to call this chord by a different name. They might call it C7 sharp 9. Because jazz musicians tend to think of chords being stacked in intervals of thirds. 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. So when they see a note that's foreign to the chord, they change it enharmonically to suit that mode of thinking. And then what happens is you pick up a book, you classically trained people pick up a book with this chord spelled out note for note, and this chord symbol above it, C7 sharp 9, and you get totally confused because you can't find the D sharp. And what the jazz musicians have done is to make jazz inaccessible to classical musicians by breaking the basic rules of theory. And what I've done is to come on the scene and say, I don't see why I can't talk about jazz using classical theory. It's music, after all. I don't have an objection to the use of the C7 sharp 9 nomenclature, provided that the underlying chord has a D sharp. Now, I tend, however, to write it as flat 10 because I tend to think more in terms of blue notes than I do in terms of chords being stacked in intervals of thirds. If you look at page 12, you'll see that I've done something very unusual in this book, in this page rather. On this page, you'll see that there's an asterisk in measure 2 and a footnote at the bottom of the page. Instead of writing eighth notes and telling you to play them as triplets, I wanted to see what it looked like if on the page I wrote triplets out. Evolved as a result of a mistake made by the earliest jazz musicians. See, they didn't know anything about theory. They were playing the swing eighths, but they wrote it down incorrectly as either eighth notes or dot 8/16. And then it was handed down as a tradition that when we see this or this, we play it that way. And publishers have just loved this because, you see, you ask a publisher which music sells better, the one that looks easier or the one that looks harder. So the publisher says to the writer, will say to the writer, why don't you write eighth notes? And at the top of the page say, play them this way. And you've seen that countless times. I need to tell you about that. On page 17, I have a piece called The Sound of Sevenths. When you have the interval of a seventh, you have a dissonance with a lot of tension that suggests that you ought to resolve that tension by going to an interval devoid of that tension. Even if I place that tense interval in the context of a pleasing sounding jazz chord, that interval is still there. So you think that perhaps you want to resolve the chord. But jazz musicians don't have the least bit of interest in making you feel comfortable. So they frequently allow their tensions to go unresolved. And to illustrate that, I created this composition in which every chord is a seventh chord, and never once do I move to a chord of resolution. On page 18, I talk about the pentatonic scale and its manipulations, how it's used, when to use it, why it's used. And then on page 19, I created a 12-bar blues-structured composition which utilizes the pentatonic scale in the manner described on page 18. Another book that has lesson plans provided for it by the teacher's manual, Take 10 More for Jazz, is this one called Easy Jazz with 1, 4, 5, and their 7 chords. I'd like to direct your attention to the bottom of the front cover. There are 2 names on the bottom of the front cover. The one on the left says Edward B. Marks. The one on the right says Hal Leonard. Now, the name on the left is always the publisher's name. The name on the right is the distributor's name. When there's only one name at the bottom of a cover, it means that company is acting as both publisher and distributor. When I first started writing for E.B. Marks, the name on the right was not Hal Leonard, it was Belwin Mills. And then after a few years, they changed their relationship. Now, Belwin Mills used to have its distribution plant in the middle of Long Island, New York. I don't know if you know Long Island, New York, but Long Island is indeed a long island. It's 120 miles long. I have a house 100 miles out that I use as my weekend escape house. And in the city, in the Midtown Manhattan, I have my apartment, which also serves as my studio. I live in that apartment. That apartment's only 3 blocks from Carnegie Hall. My mother always wanted me to get to Carnegie Hall. I got to within 3 blocks. One day, my contact at E.B. Marks, Bernard Calvin, who recently retired at the age of 90 from E.B. Marks, many years ago, wanted to show me what a distribution plant looked like. So he took me to Belwin Mills in the middle of Long Island, and we started walking around this huge building, about a square block, with shelves all over the place, and on every shelf sat hundreds and hundreds of copies of every book that they owned. And when you want a book, and your local store doesn't have the book, Carol will call up the 800 number, and somebody will walk around with a cart, pulling books off the shelf, bringing it back to the workstation, sending it out to you, and then saying you get your materials. Well, as we're walking up and down these aisles, Bernie pulled a book off the shelf called 145, written by a man who's no longer alive, and his name is Eric Steiner, and I never met him. The book, Bernie told me, had been very successful for about 25 years. But its success was diminishing now. Its popularity was waning. So he said, why don't you write a book, similar material, but a little more concentrated on the jazz element. So I picked up his book to see what had made it successful, and I gave it at first a cursory glance, like this, which ordinarily doesn't tell you anything. It's like kicking the tire on a new car. It doesn't tell you. But actually something came up at me. I noticed the whole book was in C major. I immediately understood one of the reasons for the book's success. You see, I know that teachers don't want to present insurmountable problems or challenges to their students, and what better way to avoid that but to keep them in the same place for a while? I thought that that was a flaw, that if I were to write such a book, I would take a modified multi-key approach in order to correct for that. Then I wanted to see how we use the chords, the 1, the 4, and the 5, 7 chords, and I noticed that every time the 1 chord was used, in the key of C major, it was always in root position. It never appeared in an inversion anywhere in the book. The 4 chord always appeared in second inversion, never any other way. The 5-7 chord always appeared in first inversion, never any other way. It might be useful to do that a few times, but I didn't think that a whole book's worth was warranted. So I decided that I would use the chords in a more characteristic manner, and I will tell you in less than a minute what that characteristic manner is. If you would please open the book to pages 2 and 3, you'll see that I have some theory there. At the top of page 2, I talk about how the primary chords, the 1, 4, and 5, 7 chords, are derived from scales. Then at the bottom of page 2 and the top of page 3, I show how inversions are achieved from root positions. And then in the middle of page 3, I talk about the most important subject of the jazz musician, which is voice leading. Not to be confused with voicing. Voicing means how you spread the notes out in a single chord. Here are C, E, and G, and here are C, E, and G again, which I have voiced differently. Voice leading, however, refers to the movement of one tone in a chord to its corresponding tone in the next chord. Is it moving by stationary motion, by stepwise motion or by leap. By leap means by more than the interval of the third. If I go root position C to root position F, then I'm moving by leap. Every note in that first chord is moving by leap to every note in the second. The C moves to the F by a fourth, the E to the A by a fourth, the G to the C by a fourth. That's not considered a good sound in jazz. What's considered a good sound in jazz is to minimize the leaps and increase the numbers of stepwise and stationary motion. The only way to achieve that is through a mixture of root positions and inversions. So if I were to play, for example, C major root position to F major second inversion, I now get stationary motion in one voice and stepwise motion in the other voice. That's considered a good sound. In order for your students to be able to achieve that sound, to play with good voice leading, they have to be comfortable playing with inversions. The earlier the better. So what I do is I give my student exercises to play chords in inversion. I bet if you asked your student to play a G triad in second inversion, I bet the student would first have to play it in root position, and then in first inversion, and then second inversion. But if the student knew a little theory, the theory being that in root position, the bottom note of the chord is the first note of the scale. In first inversion, the third note of the scale is the bottom note, and the second inversion, the fifth note of the scale is the bottom note. The sooner they can play chords in inversions, the sooner they will be able to implement the traits of desirable voice leading. You will find in looking at my music, at all of my music, with the exception of one book that I wrote in which I deliberately played everything, wrote everything in root position, all of my work is informed by an awareness of the principles of desirable voice leading. Here on page 6 is a typical piece in this book. At the top of the page, I present the chords used in this piece in the root position and inversions, and then I have preparatory exercises. The piece itself, called The Cool Cat, is in ABA structure, and the teacher's manual, Take 10 More for Jazz, will suggest that instead of asking your students to play the first group of notes in the right hand the way they're written, that you ask them to play it as a blocked chord, and ask them a couple of questions. Say to them, what is the name of this chord? And you hope they'll say G major, and you say, is it in root position or in an inversion? I did not have the overview of the series that I subsequently developed. The first couple of years, I wrote materials that were more on the upper intermediate to early advanced level. But after a couple of years of writing, I realized that I would not be able to make an impact on the teaching community until I developed earlier level materials. And so I have been working backwards ever since, filling in the gaps. It turns out that I like to write that way. If I'm to write a 3-book series, I'll write book 3 first. And then I'll write book 2 to see how I got there. And then I'll write book 1 to see how I got there. I don't recommend this method for anybody else, but it works for me. I'm loath to change what works. But my ultimate goal was the ability to motivate the student at the very first lesson with jazz materials. And I succeeded in doing that with a book that has become very popular. It's called Razzle Dazzle. And because of this book's popularity, which I realized early on, I wrote several sequels to it, which I'll talk about in just a minute. This book consists of stationary hand position solos by the student, 5-finger position solos, but at the bottom of every page is an optional teacher's duet part that's very, very jazzy. The first piece in the book is called Clothespin Boogie on page 2. And here it is as a duet. off, and I decided to do several sequels to it. Before I tell you about the sequels, I'd like to tell you a couple of anecdotes. One is about about a lady, a piano teacher in the Bronx, New York, by the name of Lacambini Ramos. She's from the Philippines. She has a couple of interesting ideas that I want to share with you. She, in addition to presenting her students at various times during the year in recital where each student plays one or two pieces, I'm sure all of you do that as well, she always has one recital which is a one composer theme, and she asks that composer to be present. It's nice for the students to have a celebrity in the room. It's also nice for the composer to be present to hear his music, watched up by a bunch of kids. About a third of her students were beginners and played from my Razzle Dazzle books. She rented a community center with a grand piano, had an electric piano behind the real piano, and she played the optional duet parts with those students. The other 2/3 of her students played from a series of books of mine, many of which are on that wall, called Lee Evans Arranges. Those are all supplementary books, as I mentioned earlier. Lee Evans Arranges, Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Harold Arlen's, Easy Jazz Standards, and so on. There are 35 books in that series that are designed to sound professional and to sound improvised, but not to be too difficult to play. They're kind of intermediate to upper intermediate level. I'll play from from a couple of those books later on. Now, another anecdote I want to tell you about this is when the students played in that recital, each student had drawn a picture of the piece that he was or she was playing, and on a piece of paper, a long piece of paper. The teacher's daughter, a teenager, presented this kind of easel with the picture with clothespins and the clothesline, and then lifted the page to reveal the next picture with the next piece that the student was going to play. A nice little adjunct to the experience. Another little tale I want to tell you is about several years ago in Toledo, Ohio. Believe it or not, it was in Ohio. I know I'm in Dayton right now. After a workshop that I had done a number of years ago, a music dealer came up to me and handed me this object, which says Razzle Dazzle by Lee Evans, and it lists all the titles of the book Razzle Dazzle. And I'm very unsophisticated when it comes to technology. I'm very late to the game, so to speak. A couple of years ago, I was forced to learn how to operate a computer, because if you're a college professor, you cannot operate without, you can't download rosters, you can't enter grades without doing it on a computer. So I finally learned how to do it, reluctantly. This, I thought, was a compact disc. That's how unsophisticated I was. But what it is software that Yamaha put out for their Clavinova piano, which has a slot in it. What Yamaha did was to orchestrate all the teacher's duet parts in this book and put it on this software. And so if the student has the Clavinova piano, can then insert the software and play with an orchestra. Now, the music dealer who handed me this object said, "Have you ever seen this before?" I said, "No, I have not. It never appeared on any of my royalty statements." So I called my contact at Hal Leonard. I described this on the telephone to him, and he said, "Let me contact Yamaha and see what they say." A couple of weeks later, he got back to thumbs up, private eye, brain teaser, neck and neck, belly dance, and so on. After the book came out, I realized that I thought of another great title. It was too late, the book was out already. The title that I thought of was Rear End Collision. In this book, the student plays in 5-finger positions. However, at various points in the book, the student is moved to a different 5-finger position in the book. Here is belly dance on page 4.
Would you mind skirting over left?
Now these are all elementary level because they're stationary hand position, but the next level up may be found in this book called Jazzmatazz, which is in your packet number 2, which If you take everything out of packet number 2, please, you'll find this book there. Every stack had a, I don't know what happened to it. Does anybody else have a pack 2 or sitting next to somebody else who has a pack 2 that you can share? You can sit up here with me. Jazzmatazz. If you look under the table of contents at the foreword, you'll see that it'll tell you whether to play that piece with straight 8s or swing 8s, with that triplet rhythm. If you look at the first piece, you'll see that you need next to the, it tells you to play the 8 notes as swing 8s. And there's a footnote at the bottom of the page also. Now, I told you earlier that first I asked the student to play with traditional classical counting. So first they go 1, 1, then 2, and 3, and 4, and 1. And then I say to them, jazz it up, which in this case is the name of the piece. And they go 1 and a 2 and, except I say don't say the and since you're not playing on the and. They go 1, a 2, a 3, a 4. I'm going to play this as a duet. He was a wonderful guy. I met him, and I had great respect for his work. He did a great service for me prior to his death, some 8 years ago or 10 years ago. He used to write a column for Clavier magazine called Commissioned by Clavier. And in that column, he would present a piece that had already been engraved for publication but had not yet been published. He would present that piece in the magazine with an analysis and with performance tips. The very last Commissioned by Clavier column that Lynn Freeman Olson wrote prior to his death was the last piece in this book, which is called Skateboard. And there were some 20,000 subscribers to Clavier magazine, piano teachers, so immediately the book became successful. I decided to do a sequel to it, and that sequel is in your packet. It's called Jazz Pizzazz, and it similarly is a book of solos with optional teacher duet part that enhance the jazz effect. I'll play the title piece in the book for you called Jazz Pizzazz on page 2. The chief characteristic of this piece is that it contains all 3 blue notes, the flat at 7th, flat at 5th, and flat at 3rd, and you'll notice that they're all in measure of 1. At the earliest possible moment, in order to motivate that student, is this book called Tickle the Ivories in Jazz Style. You'll notice by the titles on the cover or in the table of contents that every piece emulates the sound of a musical instrument. tickle the ivories, pluck that bass, jazz, bugle call, and so on. In the foreword on page 2, it tells you that all the eighth notes in this book are to be interpreted with the swing eighth or jazz triplet rhythm, without exception. I'll play Tickle the Ivories for you on pages 4 and 5, the first piece in the book. It is characterized by the use of the 2-bar ostinato in the left hand. Observance of all the articulation marks there, all the staccatos, the tenutos, and so on, the accents. I prepare my music very carefully with the classical musician in mind. I have my own personal editor to whom I bring all of my manuscripts prior to publication, and I give her credit for all the books for which she has done this editing. Here on page 2, at the very bottom of the page, it says the author gratefully acknowledges the editorial assistance provided by Marcia Clavenow for this book. She lives in Danbury, Connecticut, about 65 miles from New York City. I drive up there, bring her the manuscript. I have tremendous respect for her musicianship, and she also has had a lot of experience on all levels of teaching. She's taught as high as the college level and as low as the elementary school level. She's taught very young kids. I've never done that, so I get a perspective of teaching from her about that. She's very good with the English language, so if in my text I have spoken with garbled syntax, she corrects my English and makes me sound reasonably intelligent. Now, she does not have, she's not a professional editor, but she brings great strength to the editorial process for me by virtue of the fact that she's not comfortable playing jazz. So she doesn't accidentally play my manuscript so that they sound authentically jazzy. If it doesn't sound authentically jazzy, I know I've done something wrong. So I say, wait a minute, Marcia, put an accent on this note. Phrase here, a tenuto there, a staccato there. Whatever I can do to get her, somebody uncomfortable with jazz, to play authentically jazzy, then I know I have reached my audience. Of course, you know, writers and editors always fight with one another, and she and I indeed have had our share of fights, but we've had a lot of love between us. You see, she's my older sister. I told you she lives in Danbury, Connecticut. You know, that's where Charles Ives, the famous American composer, was born. They make a big fuss over Charles Ives in Danbury. There's a Charles Ives Center, and many of the, or most of the important cultural events of that community take place there. One day, when my sister was teaching elementary school music, she asked on a quiz, where was Charles Ives born? And one student not only wrote Danbury, Connecticut, but he put in the zip code. I'm going to show you a couple of books that you do not have at your chair, but they should be in that rack. I do, in fact, see one of them. Jack and Jill Jazz, and the follow-up book called More Jack and Jill Jazz. Now, what I've done here is to take children's songs that are not inherently jazzy, and by using two techniques in the main, I have made them jazzy. One technique is anticipation of the beat, and the other is detached touch, particularly at the ends of phrases. You can do something very interesting and instructive with your students by having them take a melody, one note at a time, that they've learned in their classical literature. And come back the next week playing it so that it sounds like jazz. By employing these two techniques, anticipations of the beat and detached touch, especially at the ends of phrases. They'll get a big kick out of that, and they will learn an awful lot. And one big advantage is that's the first step towards improvising, because you want to get away from the printed page if you're going to improvise, and that'll give you a little more confidence that you'll be able to do so. So here is an example of Jack and Jill Jazz with a piece called Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Anticipations of the beat, detached touch at the end of phrases. Jazz for kids of all ages. If you look at the table of contents, you'll notice that every piece refers to an activity that children engage in. Hide and seek, kid stuff, fun and games, horsing around, rollerblades, and so on. And in the forward, under the contents, it tells you that in each piece, it'll tell you next to the tempo mark whether to play the eighth notes as eighth notes or as swing eighths. Let me play the title piece of the book for you. It's called Kid Stuff. It's on page 4, and at the top of the page it does say to play swing eighths. Scale. The pentatonic scale is, as you know, a 5-note scale that may be represented by playing the 5 black keys of the piano starting with F sharp. And that's why there's a lot of pentatonic material out there that's black key. But one need not have to play black keys to play pentatonic. I can start on C, a white key, play that interval relationship, and I get the pentatonic scale. So I thought, just to be different, I would create a piece that was exclusively white key pentatonic. And you will find that in this piece called China. It's a 4-movement, early intermediate level suite for piano. When I was 2, my brother, who was 5 years older than I, was starting violin lessons and was practicing the violin in that room. My sister, who was a year younger than my brother, was taking piano lessons and was put in that room, all classical music. When I was 5, I started taking classical piano lessons. I studied classical music for 14 years with 4 different teachers, 10 years with the first teacher. Then I went to the High School of Music and Art, classical music. Undergraduate and graduate school, classical music. Never had a job. And my father owned a drugstore a block away from where our apartment was in the Bronx. And when I'd go to visit him every day, and he would be playing classical music on the radio stations in his drugstore. In those days, there were 2 classical music stations on AM. FM had not yet existed. WQXR, the New York Times radio station, which still exists as an FM station today, they play classical music 24 hours a day. WNYC, which today still exists as an FM station, is today a national public radio station. So there's, during the day, a lot of talk, but at night they play great music, and I especially am partial to 20th century music, and they play a lot of 20th century music, so I listen to them an awful lot. Of all the classical music I heard while growing up, I liked the Impressionist composers' music best. Debussy, Ravel, Scriabin, Delius. I love Mompo, Federico Mompo, a composer from Barcelona who lived into his 90s and just died about 20 years ago. If you're not familiar with Mompo's music, you must become familiar with his music. Fantastic. M-O-M-P-O-U, Federico Mompo. So I decided, the problem was that this, most Impressionist music was too hard to play. So I decided that in order to get students to experience playing Impressionistic music while they're still intermediate level rather than waiting until advanced level, that I would create intermediate level Impressionistic music for them. Now, and I created 3 books based upon Impressionist principles. One is called Nature Music, which you have there. The other is called Enchanted Ocean, and the other is called Celestial Odyssey. Let's talk about Impressionism for a moment. Impressionism was really an art movement that began in France in the late 1800s. And then composers like Debussy and Ravel also wrote music that reflected some of the principles. For example, vagueness. You didn't see a photographic representation of a leaf. You saw a couple of brush strokes that suggested, that gave you the impression that perhaps it was a leaf. Just as composers played a chord that suggested maybe it was a particular chord, but it was pretty hard to define. It was very vague. Rhythms were very vague. If you listen to Debussy's Clair de Lune, it sounds as though it should be counted 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but it's really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, something like that. It's very ambiguous, a lot of ambiguity. The whole tone scale was one of the devices that these composers used to create tonal ambiguity with its equal intervals. The pentatonic scale was another device used by these composers. The octatonic scale, which is also known as the symmetrical scale, which is also known as the diminished scale. The octatonic scale is whole step, half step, whole step, half step. The reason it's called, by some people, a diminished scale is because every other note constitutes a diminished chord. You get a diminished chord as part of that. And then they were also using the medieval diatonic church modes: Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian modes. So I decided that, and another thing, these Impressionist composers did not write this heavy Germanic type of music like symphonies. Debussy and Ravel never wrote a symphony. They wrote music that was to a great extent inspired by nature. La Mer, the ocean. Afternoon of a Faun, Footprints in the Snow. So I decided to use all of these devices and influences to create my music. If you look at the first piece in Nature Music book, you'll see that I use the Aeolian mode here. Now the Aeolian mode is really evolved into the natural minor scale. If you play the white keys of the piano from A to A, you get the natural minor scale, or what is known as the Aeolian mode. And the composers of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century did not like that scale because it had a whole step between 7 and 8. And they didn't feel that 7th note pulled to the 8th note as well as it should. So therefore they changed it. They created 2 altered scales. One of them is called harmonic minor, as you know, the raised 7, and the other is melodic minor, raised 6th and 7th, ascending, Aeolian mode descending, natural minor scale descending. Leonard Bernstein used to say that in the harmonic minor with the raised seventh, the seventh note loves the eighth note, wants to hug it and kiss it. But in the harmonic, in the natural minor, the seventh note just likes the eighth note, maybe just wants to shake its hand. Here's first stirring of string. Enchanted Ocean, well, I just opened the Angelfish on page 6, so I'll play that one for you. Enchanted Ocean, I'll play the last piece in the book. It's called The Planets, page 22. Take on a new student, and as I told you earlier, I will only take on 3 or 4 students maximum at any one time. It is with the understanding on the part of the student that he or she will be learning composition, especially, and improvisation and other jazz techniques. In order for me to get, you see, I'm especially big on composition. I subscribe to the notion that you learn the route better if you're the driver rather than the passenger in the car. And if you're composing, in a manner of speaking, you're the driver. You develop musicianship skills very quickly that way. In order to get the student to feel or to believe that he or she is able to compose without being born a genius, I'd like to demystify the compositional process by showing them the craft of composition, by showing them the way composers think. And among the illustrations that I give them to put them at ease is the following. I say to them, that's a theme written by a composer who was also a great violinist years ago by the name of Paganini. Many years after he composed that theme, another composer from Russia came along by the name of Rachmaninoff, who decided to use that theme to write a series of variations. These became known as Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini by Rachmaninoff. And one of the variations of that theme sounds like this. And I say to them, can you discern the relationship between the theme and the variation? I say, look, in the original theme, it goes up a third, down a second, up a fifth. Rachmaninoff said to himself, instead of going up a third, down a second, he'll go down a third, up a second, changing the direction of the intervals, putting it into a warmer key, and harmonizing it. And that's called inversion, when you make the intervals go in the opposite direction, the same distance. I say to the student, here's a piece of blank music manuscript paper. I'd like you to compose a 2-measure motive for me right now at the lesson. I usually have to help the student write that down because the student can't figure out the rhythm of what's being played. They have no problem composing something, but they have a problem notating it with the proper rhythm. So they write it down, and I say play it. Play it, and then I say, now in the next 2 measures, I want you to create an inversion of that motive. I say, I want you to start on either the first note that the motive started on or on any other note. It doesn't make a difference. And once you've chosen your first note, I want you to make all the intervals go in the opposite direction. And then when the student has written that down, I then say to the student, play measures 1 through 4 consecutively. Because I want the student to hear that he or she has created a relationship that makes the music sound unified. That's what composing is all about. Composing is creating relationships. You don't take a bucket of notes and throw them up in the air and hope that they land in the right place. Composing is thinking about how to create relationships so the music will have unity. Here is a piece of mine called Jazz Suite for Piano. Under the title on the first page of music, it says 4 thematic related pieces in the jazz idiom. If you go to page 7, you'll see that I show the thematic relationships by having arrows point from notes used in one movement to those same notes used in subsequent movements, albeit in a different context. In measures 1 and 2, I go from E to an F, and I play around with that half-step relationship quite a bit throughout the composition. You'll notice that I even begin the second movement with the notes E and F, and at the end of the second movement, 5 bars from the end, I play the E and the F in reverse order, F, E. Not only is this a retrograde, that is to say, the notes of a motive played in backwards order, but it's also an inversion, since instead of going up a half step, I'm going down a half step. By the way, a good example of an inversion and a retrograde may be heard in George Gershwin's I Got Rhythm. See, that's the same intervals coming down as up, and it's also the notes in reverse order. That's called retrograde. Well, now, I end the first movement of this piece in the last 2 bars, so the first movement with the notes E, A, F sharp, and I take that little germ of a motive, and in the middle of the second movement, I begin a pattern that starts with those notes. And I end the movement with E, A, F sharp, expanding it to include a C sharp at the end. So now I have E, A, F sharp, C sharp, and that's how I begin the third movement. with those notes, E, A, F sharp, C sharp, and I expand it to include a B. And I take this group of notes, and at the end of the second system on that page, last bar, I play it in retrograde. So you can hear relationships all the time. Sitting here thinking, how many of your students in your total teaching lifetimes will become professional musicians? I dare say not too many. You may produce some teachers, but mostly your teaching, I think, will result in people who use music as an avocational interest, music as a hobby. And if they're going to use music as a hobby, they should ideally be in possession of certain skills that often go overlooked in the teaching community. One of those skills is improvisation. And the reason why teachers have not introduced improvisational skills to their students is because the teachers themselves are uncomfortable with those devices. So what I've done is to spend quite a few years developing materials that would enable the teacher to develop those skills along with the students so that the teacher will be comfortable with it and will be able to introduce it to the student. Sight reading is a very important skill. Yet very few teachers give their students sight reading. I know my own first teacher gave me about 8 or 10 different pieces every year, and the only reason I got sight reading experience is because at the age of 14 I started to play in summer resorts, and singers would put their music in front of me and I'd be forced to read it in the afternoon for the evening's performance. So that's the way I got it. You know, sight reading, the cumulative value of sight reading frequently is immeasurable. Your piano probably looks just like mine. You have a stack of music here, a stack here, a stack here. At the end of the lesson, when your student is dying to get out and go out and play ball, take a piece, the last 5 minutes of the lesson, take a piece out at the right level and ask the student to sight read it. You're going to notice that your students make the same mistakes that mine make. They don't look at the key signature. And they can't remember it even if they do look at it. But it really has immeasurable value. If they sight read every week, just once a week at your lesson, for even as little as a year, they will develop musicianship skills that you'll see will pay dividends. If the student is going to compose music, the student has to notate the music. Well, I teach the student notation at the same time that I'm teaching composition. What is it that I'm looking for? Well, by the way, when a student brings me a composition, even if it is an advanced student, the first thing I check for is notation, and then I check for content. What am I looking for? Well, I want to make certain that the note head is either on the line or the space, not ambiguously placed so I can't tell what it is. Then I want to be sure that the stems are going in the right direction. In contemporary engraving, all third line notes get down stems, and notes above that also get down stems. Any note below the third staff line gets an up stem. How long should a stem be? Well, not that long. You look at any engraved music, you'll see that stems are 1 octave in length. If you have an A, it goes up to the next A. If you have a B, it goes down to the next B. And if the only exception is ledger line notes, the stem ends at the 3rd staff line. Now, what about stem direction when you have 2 notes on a beam? Let's say an F and a C on a beam as 8th notes. Which way does the stem go? Well, the note that determines the stem direction is the note furthest away from the center line. So F is the note furthest away from the center line. It gets an up stem, therefore they will both get up stems. The angle of the beam should reflect the direction of the music. The same is true of chords. F, A, C. The F is further away from the center line than the other 2 notes. It gets an up stem, therefore the whole configuration gets an up stem. I also am looking for spatial logic. I want a half note to get twice as much room in the bar as a quarter note, not the other way around. I also am looking, when the student writes music on a grand staff for piano, that the beats are in vertical alignment. Beat 1 is here, beat 2 is here. You can't write beat 2 there, beat 2 in the other hand. That way, musicians don't know how to read that. Those are some of the things that I look for. And I sit there with an eraser and tell my student why I'm going to erase his music. By the way, the eraser is the most valuable tool that a composer has. Get a good eraser on the end of your pencil. And also get a good shredder. Your students may listen to their favorite radio station and come back to the piano and succeed in playing the melody of the song that they heard. But when it comes to putting chords to that melody, they're often at a loss to know how to do so. There are criteria for putting chords to melodies. It's called harmonization, and Dr. Martha Baker, who wrote our teacher's manuals for us, she and I have created 5 books together, and that's one of the books that I will show you in the second half of my presentation today. At Christmas time, the family will be standing around the piano as your student plays Silent Night. And somebody in the family is likely to say, I cannot sing it in that key. Well, it's one thing to know the principle of transposition, which is to start on a different note and duplicate all the intervals that were present in the original. It's another thing to do it a few times so that you get the hang of doing it. So in our transposition, in our harmonization books, we provide transposition opportunities. Speaking of using music as a hobby, all of your students, including you, are going to go out and buy sheet music, popular sheet music, and fake books. And they all have these alphabetical chord symbols, like C7, flat 10. And if those students are not taught that information, they're going to come back and say, my teacher never taught me this. And it's crazy. This is the real world of music. Everybody goes out and buys popular sheet music. There's no reason why your students should not have that opportunity to learn that. It's so accessible, it's ridiculous. In classical music, if you have a second inversion C major triad, the musician is likely to use Roman and Arabic numerals to describe it. 1, 6, 4 in the key of C major. The Roman numeral describes the position of the chord relative to the scale degree upon which it was built. You build a chord on the first note of the scale, it's called a 1 chord. You build a chord on the second note of the scale, it's called a 2 chord. The Arabic numerals represent the intervals that are present in this inversion, the 6th and the 4th. But jazz musicians don't use this nomenclature. They say this is a C major chord, but it has G as its bottom note, C/G. That's the whole basis of the alphabetical chord symbol system. And there's no reason why your students shouldn't learn this. Now, I don't want to sound self-serving, but I've written a book on this subject. Which happens to be my second most important book in this room, which I'll show you later. It's called How to Play Chord Symbols in Jazz and Popular Music. The first most important book is Learn to Compose and Notate Music, which I'm eager to show you in the second half of my presentation. Now, I mentioned the word fake book. The word fake is synonymous with improvise. So a fake book is a book of sketches called lead sheets, which consists of the melody, the chord symbol, the alphabetical chord symbols, and the words. And you're supposed to take that information and create a full realization of it. If you want to do so in a rock style, you put in rock elements. You want to do so in a classical style, you put in some classical elements. You want to do it in a jazz style, you put in jazz elements. Now, everybody thinks that fake books and playing from a lead sheet was something that jazz musicians invented, and they often look askance at that. But the truth is that classical musicians invented that practice. In Baroque times, musicians used to play from lead sheets, but they weren't called lead sheets. They were called figured bass. And it consisted of a note and a couple of numbers underneath it, which told the student, or told the harpsichordist rather, what inversion the chord was being played in by the rest of the orchestra. And it was accepted that all the harpsichordists in that era knew the embellishments and ornamentations that were characteristic of that music, and the harpsichordists used to improvise a full realization of that part. You know that improvisation occurred even earlier in music history than Baroque times? If you look at the Harvard Dictionary of Music, under the word improvisation, it makes reference to the fact that improvisation resulted in a more melismatic, a more melodious Gregorian plain chant. So you're talking 6th century here that people were improvising. A lot of credit goes to musicians that they don't deserve. We didn't innovate these techniques, we only put them into a different context, a jazz context. It was the classical musicians who innovated it. Well, you know, when I was a kid, some enterprising person took a 3x5 index card and wrote a song on it, just the melody, the chord symbols, and the words. He pasted 3 of these index cards to a loose leaf page, and then 3 on the opposite page. And this was even before there were Xerox machines. They used to use mimeographing and rexigraphing, and they created a whole loose leaf book of these songs and sold them from the back of a truck for $10, and it was illegal because nobody was getting paid for it. The composers weren't getting paid, the publishers weren't getting paid, the engravers weren't getting jobs to engrave the music. So the publishers got wise and they said, let's put out our own fake books. We own all this material. So they put out some fake books. One fake book, that's one of the better ones, one of the few better ones, is called the legal fake book. But most fake books are highly flawed in certain respects. For example, they put too many songs on a page, so once you get past the age of 15 and your eyes deteriorate a little bit, you can't read that stuff anymore. Another thing is that the songs themselves are frequently second-rate. You know, composers, there are only two publishers left that own all the great copyrights. There's Warner Brothers, and even Warner Brothers has been absorbed by Alfred now, and Hal Leonard. They own the two companies own the great songs. Those companies, when they put out a fake book, they can't put out a fake book of only their hits because they don't have that many hits. It's mostly secondary stuff. What they do is they lure you to buy this anywhere from $20 to $40 book by putting in just enough hits to get you to buy the book. And the other stuff, the secondary stuff, you're never going to play. It's second-rate material, but that they own it and they want to make a profit from it. Then the chords that are shown on those sheets derive from the original sheet music. Now, when Irving Berlin or Richard Rodgers or Cole Porter wrote a song in 1940 that's still played today as a standard, those songs are going to live forever. Those chords sound like you belong in 1940. The adept jazz musician or pop musician changes those chords, reharmonizes those chords. It's called chord substitution. And in the second half of my presentation, I'm going to show you 2 of the most widely used chord substitution techniques used by the pros. So you're going to know how they do it. I went to my publisher and I told them these things that I'm telling you about the inferiority of a lot of these fake books that they put out. And I asked them for permission to put out a fake book that would consist of only the highest quality material that would be the cream of every professional pianist's repertoire, or should be part of every professional pianist's repertoire. And I would, instead of having 6 songs on a page, I'd have maybe 1 song on a page, or 1 song on 2 pages, so if you're an old geezer like me, you can read it. And then I said I would change the chords so that I'll only use the original chords where they are good chords, but then I'll go use other chords, so that when you're playing from this book, you will sound like a pro. And they gave me permission. I chose 126 songs. They didn't say to me, you have to use this song or that song. I chose the songs. And I came out with a book that I'm very proud of called The Professional Pianist's Fake Book. There are a couple of copies back there on the bottom. And there's also a book called The Professional Pianist's Christmas Fake Book, which uses the same criteria. And I'll open at random to show you that there are not 6 songs on the page. There's 1 song on 2 pages. So, as I say, you can read very easily. The professional piano paper. Folks, I've got a lot of material and ideas to share with you, and I only have until 1 o'clock to do that. So if you come back in 15 minutes at 10:02, I'll tell you the other half of everything that I know.